A wolf does not howl the way the dime novels say. Up close, it is a low, wet, rolling sound that the body understands a half second before the mind does, and what it understands is that the counting has changed hands, and she is no longer the one doing the counting. By the time Mara Quill got a bare hand to the lead rope, the rope was already whipping out of her fingers, and the mule was already gone sideways into the dark spruce, and the 4 head of cattle her dead father had bled for were already scattering across the open snow above the tree line like spilled grain. The pack came down off the wind out of nowhere, and everywhere at once, gray on gray, low to the crust, flowing between the rocks like water that had learned to hunt. She heard the lead cow scream, a sound she did not know a cow could make, and she was not even fighting for herself. She was turning already back uphill toward the broken-down old man in the snow behind her, the one the other drovers had looked at that morning and quietly decided to leave. Rewind. Go back 2 weeks down off the high white spine of the range to a rotten little place called Wolftooth that was less a town than a wound somebody had cut into the mountain and forgotten to close. Mud and old snow in the one street. A mercantile, a saloon with a false front a foot taller than the building behind it, a stock pen of gray rails, and at the end of the street a long, low office with a brass plate that said, Hollister Land and Stock, and underneath, smaller, bounties paid. That brass plate is the whole story if you know how to read it, and almost nobody in Wolftooth did. They walked past it every day the way you walk past a snake you have decided is a stick. Mara Quill was 23 years old, and a long way from the loom rooms of Lowell where she had been raised, where her hands had learned thread and ledger lines, and nothing that was worth a thing up here. Her father had come west to file a high country graze claim on a green shelf of land below the pass, Quill's Bench, the only sweet grass for 40 miles, a meadow so good the elk wintered on it, and he had worked it 3 summers and died of his chest the winter before, coughing into a rag he wouldn't let her see, and left her the paper for the bench and the 4 head and a mule and not $1. She wore a dove-gray wool dress buttoned to the throat and a heavy dark green blanket coat and a man's wool muffler. And under all of it, on a rawhide string against her skin, she wore her mother's wedding ring worn nearly to a wire, and in her coat pocket she carried a carved thing the size of her thumb, a clumsy little elk whittled out of antler bone with one antler cut longer than the other. Her mother had made it the winter Mara was born, and died of that same winter. A bird needs only one wing to remember the way home, her mother used to say, which made no sense to a child, and would make terrible sense to her later, up on the snow with everything else stripped away. She came into Wolftooth to do the one thing the law required of her, drive her father's stock over the pass before the snow closed it for good, and register them on the home range on the far side, where the claim could be proved up and held. A date was inked on the paper in a clerk's tidy hand, and the date did not care that her father was dead or that she had never driven stock a mile in her life. Miss it, and the bench reverted to the territory, open for the next lease. And the man behind the brass plate knew the date better than she did, because he had been waiting on it for 3 years, the way a patient man waits on fruit to fall. And if you have ever stood at the bottom of something everybody you respect has told you that you cannot climb, and felt the awful private certainty in your own chest that you are going to do it anyway, then you already know the kind of person this story is about, and you already belong on this channel. That is the only kind of story I tell up here. The ones the whole town has written off, climbing the pass alone, into the part of the mountain nobody comes back from. Take a second and subscribe, because the people who do are the ones I am telling these stories to. Silas Hollister was a soft-bellied, hard-eyed man of about 50, with iron-gray side whiskers and a fine fur-trimmed coat and a flat-brimmed black hat He did not take off indoors, not for anyone, not for a woman. He owned the lease on every acre around Quill's bench, and the one green shelf he did not own was the one he wanted most. And the one thing standing between him and it was a girl with 4 cows and a deadline. He had her sit across his big desk and he poured her coffee. She did not drink and he was pleasant as church. "Sell me the paper," he said. $40. Cash money today. You'll never get them over the top, miss." She said no quietly because her father had taught her that the quiet no is the one that holds. Hollister smiled like that was the answer he'd planned around. He turned a paperweight on his desk a quarter turn, a habit, and he said, mild as milk, "The pass is full of wolves this year. Worst I've seen." She thought he was warning her, the way you'd warn anybody. He was not warning her. He was telling her what he had built. Because here is what the brass plate meant. And here is why old men in that country lowered their voices when they spoke of it. Hollister ran the predator bounty for the whole district. $3 a wolf, paid out of the territorial fund on his say-so, on his count, with no man above him to check the tally. And for 2 years he had done a thing so quiet and so patient that nobody had put it together. He had paid his own men to not trap the high passes, to leave the iron traps hanging empty on their pegs and let the pack breed and fatten and grow bold and lose its fear of the smell of men. He salted the high trail with bait all autumn, hauling up the offal from his own slaughter pens and seeding it through the rocks of the pass, so that the wolves came to think of that one notch in the mountain as a place where meat appeared. He was not fighting the wolves. He was farming them, growing a crop of them against the day he chose to harvest. A fat pack meant a fat bounty whenever he finally called it in and let his men sweep it. And in the meantime it meant that no stock and no fool of a homesteader's daughter would ever cross that pass alive in the snow. He had taken the mountain itself, the oldest free thing there was, and made it a tool he owned, and he rented it out in deaths and called it weather. 3 men in that street tried to tell her in their way, each one certain he was being kind. The freighter Boone Tully, who had a face like a split boot and a voice like a barrel rolling downstairs, told her flat across the mercantile counter that no woman had any business on Wolf Tooth Pass in October, that she'd be wolf bait in a petticoat by the second night. And the whole store laughed, the warm, ugly laugh of people relieved it isn't them. And the name stuck to her like pitch and went up and down the street ahead of her by supper time. The liveryman, a decent man with a sick wife, wouldn't rent her a second mule at any price and wouldn't say why, only looked at his boots. And Deputy Royce Carver, who wore a tin star on his coat and took Hollister's money in his pocket where the star couldn't see it, leaned in the bounty office doorway and told her almost gently, almost like a father, that if she went up there and didn't come back down, "Nobody's climbing after you, miss." 3 respected men. Not one of them was lying. They were simply, every one of them, wrong about what she was, because they had all measured her by the loom rooms and the petticoat, and none of them had measured the part of her that had buried a father alone and not wept where anyone could sell it back to her. She found her one ally in the place the town had thrown away, the one sound timber in a pile of rot. His name was Asa Pruitt, and he was past 70, a white-haired old timber cruiser and stock drover with a chest full of bad winters and hands like roots and a face folded up like a saddlebag. He had cruised that range for 30 years and knew the pass the way. You know an old wife's face, every mood of it, where it iced first and where the wind stood, and where a man could get out of the weather if he had to. He'd worked for Hollister once, in the lean years when a man took what work there was, and he had been there, 2 autumns back, dozing in the back of the bounty office on a cold night, when Hollister told his foreman in plain flat words to leave the high traps empty and let the pack run, and We'll leave the homestead question to the weather, and the weather don't testify. Asa had heard every word of it through the thin board wall. Asa was the only living man who had, which made Asa, though neither he nor anyone else in Wolftooth knew it yet, the single most dangerous old man on the mountain, a witness walking around on a broken-down body that everybody had already mentally buried. Mara hired him with the last of her coffee and bacon and a promise of a share she did not have yet, because he was the only one who would go, and because when she told him she meant to bring out the bench her father died on, something came up in the old man's wet eyes that had not been there in years. They went up together the morning the barometer fell, 4 head and 2 mules and an old man and a girl, into the spruce, and then above it, up toward the white teeth of the pass, and the town watched them go the way you watch a thing you have already decided not to remember. They made the Timberline by the second afternoon, and that was where the weather turned its face. The first day had almost fooled her. Hard blue sky, the snow squeaking dry under the hooves, the cattle willing, Asa riding loose and easy and naming the peaks as they passed like old friends. But the second afternoon the wind came around to the north, and the sky went the flat, dead white of a fish's belly. And the temperature fell off a shelf so fast she felt it in her teeth. Asa read it in a single breath, drawn through his nose. "We turn back," he said. "Now, this one's got a mean streak." But the trail behind them was already filling, the way down softening to a gray blur, and the trail ahead was the only ground Mara had and the only date that would hold her claim. And somewhere out in the white the first wolf called, long and low, and was answered from a second ridge, and then a third, the 3 sounds boxing them in on 3 sides. The cattle began to mill and roll their eyes and bunch up tail to tail. The mules laid their ears flat. The animals knew before the people did. The animals always do. They had read the same page of the mountain that the wolves had written, and they had done the arithmetic first. Asa got stiffly down to hobble the lead mule, and his bad leg went out from under him on a sheet of black ice under the powder, and there was a sound like a green branch breaking that was not a branch, and the old man was down in the snow with his shin bent wrong beneath him, and his face gone the color of tallow, and that one wrong angle of an old man's leg was the moment the whole mountain decided what kind of night it was going to be. The pack hit them in the last gray light, and it was not a battle. It was arithmetic, cold and fast and without malice, which is the worst way to be killed. The cattle were gone in minutes, driven bawling off the open ground and down into the dark timber where the snow was deep, and a cow founders and a wolf does not. The mules broke their hobbles and ran, and were not seen again. And Mara Quill, who had every reason and every invitation in the world to run with them, to save the one life she could surely save, instead got both bare hands up under a 70-year-old man's arms and locked her fingers and started to drag him uphill, backward, away from the blood smell rising off the snow, toward a black notch in the rock she had no good reason to think was shelter, because the only other choice was to leave him, and she had been left herself by a whole town that very morning, and she had decided somewhere on the climb that she would die before she did that to another living soul. She got him 50 yards. Her arms shook and her breath came in sobs, and the old man kept telling her through his teeth to drop him and go, "Go on, girl, no sense in 2." And she did not answer because she did not have the breath, and because the answer was no. Her strength gave out at the base of a wind-scoured drift with the dark coming down for good, and the low wet sounds closing a slow ring around them out in the white. She put her own body between the old man and the open dark. She got her father's skinning knife out of her belt with a hand she could no longer feel, and she was, in the plainest terms, fully prepared to die there with a wooden elk in her pocket, and no one alive to know what she had chosen. She was not afraid the way she had always thought she would be at the end. She was just very, very angry that it was going to be so easy for them, that her whole stubborn life was going to come to $3 a head on some fat man's ledger. Then the snow uphill of her came apart, and a shape came down through it that was bigger than any wolf, that the wolves themselves broke away from and flowed back from into the dark. And a voice she had never heard in her life scraped out 4 flat words against the wind, with no fear in them anywhere. Get behind the rock. His name was Eli Vance, and he had run the high country alone for 9 years, and he came down that slope out of the storm like a piece of the mountain that had decided to walk. He was 38 and looked older, built long and heavy through the shoulders, weather-browned, dark hair tied back going gray at the temples, and a short, dark beard frosted white with his own breath. Pale gray eyes that took the measure of a thing in a glance and gave nothing back. Along the right side of his jaw there ran a thin, pale, old mark, long-healed, that she would not learn the meaning of for weeks. He was a hunter and a wolfer by trade, the genuine article, the real thing that Hollister only pretended to be. He had been clearing that very pack out of the high passes one careful season at a time, for nothing, because somebody had to and the bounty man never would, and he had watched for 2 years with a cold growing fury as something he could not name kept feeding them and pulling them up onto that trail. He had cut their sign 2 ridges over that afternoon, and then he had cut hers laid down right over the top of theirs, a small boot dragging a big weight uphill into the storm toward the wolves instead of away. And a man who has spent 9 years learning to read snow had read that single impossible line of track and understood the whole of it in an instant. The girl, the cripple, the choice she had made. And he had turned his own back on his own safe high ground and gone down into the dark after 2 strangers, which is a thing a sensible man does not do, and which tells you everything about Eli Vance that he would spend the rest of this story refusing to say out loud. He did not fight the wolves the way the cattle had been fought. He stepped between Mara and the ring with a long gun in one hand and a torch of pitch pine in the other that he had lit somehow on the run, and he made himself bigger and louder and more certain than the dark, and he moved among them with a cold mechanical economy that had no anger and no fear in it, only knowledge, the awful competence of a man doing a thing he has done 100 times. He fired once into the closest shape and worked the action and did not waste the second barrel. He swung the torch in a low hissing arc, and the flame walked across the snow, and the pack, which understood arithmetic better than any man, recalculated the cost of the meal and melted back ridge by ridge into the storm until there was only wind. He did not look at her through any of it. When it was done, he did not ask if she was hurt. He crouched and looked at the old man's leg for 1 second and at the white sky for 2. And he said, "He'll lose that leg or his life by morning out here. My place is up. Can you walk?" It was not really a question, and she got up off the snow on legs that did not want to hold her, because the only other thing to do was to lie back down. And she had decided a long time ago that she would not lie back down for anybody. If you have made it this far into Mara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. What followed was the hardest 2 hours of Mara Quill's life. He would not carry the old man and the girl both. There was only one of him, and the trail allowed no mistakes. So he got Asa up across his own back like a sack of meal, the broken leg bound straight against a length of branch with 2 quick wraps of rope, and he told Mara to walk in his broken trail and not to stop for anything in the world, not for the cold, Not for the dark, not for me if I go down. And he went up into the white on a track that only he could see, reading the mountain by feel where there was nothing left to see at all. The drifts were to her waist and then past it. The cold was a live thing with teeth that worked in through the wool and got into the marrow of her and tried to lie her down and cover her over. Twice she went down to her chest in soft snow, and twice she clawed her way back up, because there was a long, dark shape ahead of her in the white that did not stop and did not look back and did not slow. And somewhere in that endless climb, the part of her that had always done the calculating, that had always asked what a thing would cost, simply gave up trying to understand the man ahead of her and put its head down and followed. They came at last, when she had stopped believing in arrival, to a cabin she would not have found in a year of looking, low and squat and snowbanked to the eaves, set back hard under a granite overhang so the snow off the cliff slid past it instead of bearing it. A hunter's wintering place built small and tight and hidden by a man who had meant to disappear off the face of the earth and very nearly had. He shouldered the door open against the drift. He laid the old man down by a cold black hearth and had a fire breathing and snapping inside of 2 minutes, his big hands quick and sure in the dark. And the first thing he said to her once they were inside 4 walls, before his own name, before one word about the wolves or the weather, with his back to her and his hands busy at the fire, was this: "You're safe here. I won't touch you. Bar the door if it makes you easier." That was the first proof she had that the thing which had carried her up out of the dark was not just another, larger kind of dark. It would not be the last. But it was the first, and she crossed the little room and dropped the heavy bar into its brackets. And then she slid down the wall beside the door and sat on the packed earth floor. And for the first time in 2 weeks, for the first time since she had shoveled the last frozen clods onto her father, she let herself shake. She woke at dawn to the smell of melted snow and rendered fat and wood smoke, and a thing she had not smelled in a year, which was safety. And she hated with her whole proud heart how much of her wanted it, because Mara Quill had a rule, and the rule had kept her alive through the loom rooms and the burying and the long cold months alone on the bench. Every kindness has a price. The only question is when the giver names it, and the only safety is to find the price yourself before he can. So she went straight at the debt, head down, both hands, as she went at everything. "I'll work it off," she said to his back. "Whatever it is, just tell me the toll and I'll know where I stand." Eli Vance looked at her over the old man's splinted leg for a long moment, and something moved behind those pale eyes that might have been anger, and might have been some older thing with no name left to it, and he said, "There's no toll. Stop." She did not stop. She could not. It was built into her now like a second spine. A debt unnamed was a debt that could come due in the dark as anything at all. And she had learned in the loom rooms exactly what men named as the price, when a woman had nothing else left to pay with. So for days she kept her father's knife where her hand could find it in the dark, and she watched the scarred man for the moment the real bill arrived. And the moment never came. He slept by the hearth with his back to the warm stones and his face to the door, between her and whatever was out there, every single night, and asked nothing. And the bill that never came unmade her slowly and completely in a way that no cruelty ever could have, because cruelty she had a wall for, and this she had nothing. He was not gentle. Let me be plain about that, because the dime novels lie about this too, the same way they lie about the wolves. He was blunt and short, and he provided for the 3 of them like a man stacking cordwood against a long winter, without one soft word in him anywhere. He gave her his own second pair of dry wool socks and called it managing my own feet, since you'll be underfoot all winter." He made Asa drink a bitter gray willow bark tea twice a day for the fever and the pain, and called it keeping the old man quiet so a body can think. He set the broken leg properly on the second day, when the swelling led him, with a saddle thread and a whittled splint, and a flat, terrible economy that turned Mara's stomach to watch, and saved the old man's leg and likely his life. And when it was bound and Asa was gray and sweating and breathing again, and she said, shaking, "Thank you," he said, "Don't," like the single word had cost him something he could not afford. Care in that cabin came disguised as logistics every time without exception. The socks were not warmth. They were the prevention of a problem. The tea was not mercy. It was quiet. The set leg was not tenderness. It was one less thing to go wrong. And it took Mara the better part of a month, watching it day after day, to understand that the disguise was not a lie, but a language. That a man who had decided long ago that he was no longer allowed to be kind to anyone had found the one way left to do it anyway, by calling it something else, by burying it so deep in the practical that even he could pretend he had not done it. And the snow kept coming, day on day, and sealed the pass behind them, and sealed the lower trail, and sealed the three of them into that small warm box under the cliff. The season itself had become the clock now, and there was only one way the clock ran out, and that was spring, months off, on the far side of a winter they would have to survive together, or not at all. The waiting was the danger now, the long shut-in waiting, and the cabin was very small, and so the three of them did the only thing that proud, frightened, mismatched people can do shut up in a small space, which is they began, badly and by inches, to share it. He showed her things, at first only because it was that, or watch her sit useless and cold and underfoot, and she learned them fast and hungrily, because she had decided on the climb up that she would never again be the kind of helpless that gets a person left in the snow to die. On the third day, he showed her how to render fat and keep the lamp. On the fourth day, he took her out into the blinding white behind the cabin and showed her how to set a wire snare in a rabbit run and how to read which runs were used. And the next morning, she lifted a snowshoe hare out of one stiff and cold, her first kill, and she was sick in the snow behind the woodpile where she thought he could not see. And then she was not sick, and she cleaned it with her jaw set, exactly as he had shown her. On the sixth day, she learned to split the season pine, and missed, and split it wrong, and learned again. On the eighth day, the tension that had stood between them like a third wall since the night of the drift finally snapped, over nothing at all, over a knocked-over pot of meltwater that hissed across the hot stones. She came at him sudden to grab the falling pot, and he flinched back, hard and fast. A big man flinching from a small woman's quick hand, and something in the wrongness of that broke her open, and she screamed at him, all of it, that she was not a thing he had bought and dragged up a mountain and could spend how he liked, that she would not be grateful, that she would not be owned. He went very still and very quiet, the way he went still before the wolves, and he let her finish, and then he said low, "I know what a bought thing looks like. I've seen plenty. You're not one." And that was the first time he had ever told her out loud in words who he thought she was. And it took all the fight out of her at once and left her standing there with her hands empty and her face wet. By the third week, her loom-room hands, the soft chalk and thread hands her father had been so quietly proud of, had cracked and bled and scabbed and gone hard and brown and sure, and she could split a billet of pine clean down the grain and skin out a hare in under a minute and read the morning sky for what it was bringing the way old Asa was teaching her to from his pallet by the fire. The old man propped on his good elbow and delighted past speaking, to have something to do besides mend and hurt. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the slow shrinking of the split wood stack against the wall and the slow knitting of an old man's shin. Eli watched her change across those weeks and said almost nothing about it, which from him was a great deal, was practically a speech. Once, when she dropped a buck snowshoe hare on the table that she had taken and dressed entirely alone, he looked at it and then at her cracked, sure hands and said only, "Good," and went back to his work, and she carried that one word around inside her warm for 2 days and despised herself for it. The middle of that long winter is where the old man gave her the thing that turned the whole story over, and the rough beauty of it was that he did not even know he was carrying it, had carried it up the mountain on his own broken body without knowing. Digging one night through the bottom of Mara's father's saddle pannier for dry tinder, his root-hard fingers working by feel, Asa found a folded square of paper gone soft as cloth with age and damp, addressed in her father's cramped, careful hand, sealed with a drop of candle wax and never sent, a letter written in the last bad coughing winter of his life, and meant, the outside said, to be opened only when she had safely proved up the claim and the bench was hers, free and clear. She had carried it over the pass without ever knowing it rode there. She broke the old wax by the fire with the wind walking the roof overhead, and her father spoke to her in his own dead voice across 8 months of cold ground. He told her the bench had never really been about the grass, not for him. He could have run cattle anywhere. He told her he had watched her keep score her whole short life, every kindness anyone ever did. Her logged as a debt to be squared ever since her mother died, birthing her, and the world started charging the girl interest on her own keep before she could even walk. He told her it had broken his heart by inches to watch his only daughter turn love into arithmetic, into a ledger she carried everywhere and let no one see, and that he blamed himself because he had been a hard man too and had taught her hardness by living it. And then he told her, at the last, the thing her mother had meant about the carved elk, the crooked little antler bone thing that had ridden in her pocket her whole life. An elk with 2 even antlers can only push straight ahead, he wrote, and gets turned and driven off the good ground every time by something stronger. It's the one with the crooked antler, the one that looks wrong, that can turn and hook and hold the high meadow when the big bulls come. You are the crooked one, Mara. You always were, from a baby. And I never once told you it was your strength and not your fault. And I was a coward for that. And I'm sorry for it now when it's too late to say it to your face. So I'll say it here. Quit settling debts that nobody is keeping but you. Owe the living instead. Let them owe you back, and don't you dare keep the count. And call the whole tangled mess of it love, because that is its name. She sat with the letter open in her lap a long, long time while the fire burned down. She took the carved elk out of her pocket and turned it over and over in her hard new hands, the clumsy little thing with 1 antler long, looking at it as if for the first time. And across the low fire a scarred man who had carried her up out of the dark watched her do it in the firelight and did not ask her what the paper said, and did not ask her why her face was wet. And for once, sitting there, she did not feel the bill coming for any of it. The wound came open a few nights after that, and it was his, not hers, and it cracked the whole frozen thing wide. A hard, dry lightning storm walked the southern peaks one night, all cold fire and no rain, the way they come in the high country in the deep cold, the lightning standing white on the far granite, and the thunder coming long seconds behind it, muffled by miles of snow. and the flicker of it on the cabin wall did something to Eli Vance that Mara had never seen and would never forget. He went and sat at the dark window with the long gun across his knees, not aiming it, just holding it, and he watched the far white fire on the peaks, and he was gone somewhere terrible, somewhere years away. She came and stood near him, not touching, and when she put a hand out toward his shoulder, not quite to it, he said, to the black glass and not to her, in a voice scraped all the way down to bare wood, that he had had a family once, a wife, a boy of 6 years old. There had been a fire in a mill town down in the flats, 11 years gone now, a whole row of wooden houses going up in the dry of summer, and he had carried his wife out through the smoke with her nightdress already smoldering, and laid her on the grass, and gone back into it for his son. And a man at the broken front door had caught his arm in the smoke and screamed into his face that the boy was already out and safe on the grass with the others, and Eli had believed it. He had believed it because every part of him needed it to be true, and could not bear the weight of it being false, and the boy had not been out. And by the time the screaming had sorted itself out on the grass, and he understood the lie, that no one had the boy, that no one had ever had the boy. The roof of the place was already coming down in a great gout of sparks. He had gone back in the second time anyway, into that. And that was where he earned the thin, pale mark along his jaw, going back through a burning doorway for a child who was already gone. And he had carried the small body out too late, across his arms, the way he would later carry an old man up a mountain. And the next spring, when his wife could not look at him and he could not look at the grass, he had walked up into the highest, coldest, emptiest country he could find a way into, and he had stayed there alone for 9 years, because when you finally scream up here, he said, still to the glass, the only thing that hears you is the wind, and the wind doesn't ask you any questions, and it doesn't tell you the boy is safe. And all of it turned over in her. Everything she had taken for coldness in him, every blunt word, and every flinch, and every kindness, disguised as logistics. The silence was not cruelty. The silence had never been cruelty. The silence was a man who believed, past all argument and past all comfort, that he had let a child burn because he wanted to believe a stranger, and who had decided in consequence that he no longer had the right to be heard by anything in the world that could answer him back. And then, still to the window, still not looking at her, he said the thing that detonated the engine of the entire winter, the thing she had braced against for months without knowing it was this she braced for. "I don't keep you here for a debt," he said. "I don't keep you here at all. You can go in the spring with stock or without it, and owe me nothing because you never did. There was never any toll, Mara. I tracked you up that mountain because," and there he stopped, "because a man like that has no end built for that sentence, has no word at the bottom of himself for the why of it, and the broken off not ending of it was louder in that small room than any word he could possibly have found. The life debt, the toll she had spent a whole winter braced to pay, had kept a skinning knife in reach against, had built her whole understanding of him and of herself around, was revealed, there at the dead center of everything, to have never once existed at all. There had never been a bill. There had only ever been a man who had read one impossible line of track in the snow and come down into the dark after a stranger, and could not tell her why, because the why was the one thing left alive in him that the fire had not burned all the way out. And the question of the whole story turned over in that moment on its hinge, from the small question of how does she pay him back into the far larger and far harder one. What in God's name happens to a person who has only ever in her life understood love as a transaction, as a thing owed and squared when she is finally, completely, irreversibly handed something for free? She answered it the only way she had words for, which was not with words at all. The next morning, in the first gray light, she took the carved elk out of her coat pocket where it had ridden against her whole life, and she crossed the little room and set it up on the window ledge where the first sun came in. The clumsy, crooked thing standing on the worn wood, and she let him watch her do it, made sure he was watching. "My mother made that," she said, "out of an elk's antler the winter I was born. I've kept it in my pocket 23 years. She set her hand flat beside it for a moment. "I'm keeping it where I can see it now. Where anyone can see it. Not in my pocket." He looked at it on the ledge for a long time, the firelight and the dawn both on it. He understood exactly what she was telling him, which was that she had stopped hiding. The one thing she loved had taken it out of the dark of her pocket and set it in the light where it could be taken from her, and he said nothing at all. And then he reached over with one big scarred hand and turned the little elk a half-inch on the ledge so that the long, crooked antler caught the morning light, and that small turning was the most that either of them had ever said to the other. Spring should have been the end of it, the trail opening and the stock to find and a life to start. It was not the end, because Silas Hollister down in Wolftooth was not finished, and the same long snow that had sealed the three of them in had also been sealing something the Baron did not know was still alive. The thaw came hard in late April, the way it does up there, the lower trail opening to mud and running water in the space of a week. And the first man up it was a Hollister rider, sent up to confirm a death, to find the picked clean evidence of a homesteader's daughter and a worn-out old fool who had died together on the pass in the first storm, exactly as planned, so the bench could be quietly closed out and the lease bought up cheap with no one left to file against it. What the rider found instead, when he topped the last rise, was smoke standing up blue from a cabin chimney under the overhang and three people moving around alive in the spring sun. And he sat his horse and stared for a moment and then hauled it around and ran it back down the mountain. And that was the worst thing that could possibly have happened to all of them, because Hollister could buy his way past a girl with no money and no friends and a dead claim. He could not, by any amount of money, survive Asa Pruitt. The old man was the one living witness on earth to the night the high traps were ordered left empty and the pack let run, the one ear that had heard it, and Hollister had spent 2 years comfortably believing that ear was bones on the pass. And now his own rider had brought him word that the witness was sitting up in a cabin in the spring sun, mending. Within 3 days, the Baron came up the new-thawed trail himself, not trusting it to anyone, in his fine fur coat on a good tall horse, with Deputy Royce Carver and his tin star riding at his right hand to lend the thing the color and the cover of law, and 4 hard-faced men in long dusters with lever-action rifles across their saddle bows to lend it teeth. He didn't come up that mountain to bargain or to threaten or to buy a paper. He came up to bury a matter, to put it under the ground like anything else that has started to smell. They reached the snow-banked cabin in the cold, clean blue light of a late mountain afternoon, with the high snowfields above the tree-line blazing white in the sun, and the sky a hard, scrubbed, cloudless blue. And that is the picture you must hold in your mind, because the reckoning of this story does not happen in the dark, does not happen in shadow or storm. It happens in broad, brilliant, high-country daylight, in front of witnesses, with the snow throwing the sun back up into every face. And it is not gloating, and it is not the end of the story. Carver called out first from his saddle, his voice too loud, that there was a legal matter regarding the disposition of the quill claim, and that everyone inside should come on out into the open and make this easy on yourselves. Hollister sat his horse a little behind the line of guns with his black hat square on his head and a small, contented, patient look on his soft face. The look of a man who has come a long way to collect on an investment he was always sure of. And Eli Vance, who had been a whole different man before the fire, a husband and a father, and who had then spent 9 years in the high country, being almost no man at all, a ghost that hunted wolves, stood up slow off the bench by the wall and took up nothing in his hands and went out the cabin door alone and unhurried into the spring snow to stand between 6 armed men and the 2 people behind him, exactly the way he had stood between Mara and the wolves on the night of the drift, with his empty hands loose at his sides. Because that, it turned out, when everything else had been burned and frozen out of him, was the one single thing left in Eli Vance that had never once been in question. It went bad fast, the way these things always go bad, faster than thinking. A shout went up from one of the dusters and a horse spooked sideways at the smell of old wolf kill on the wind and reared. And a rifle came down hard, and the first shot cracked flat off the granite overhang and rolled away down the valley. And Eli Vance went down backward into the trampled spring snow with a red bloom spreading high on the left shoulder of his coat. And for one single heartbeat the whole bright mountain held dead still, every man and horse frozen in the white glare. And Silas Hollister, behind his line of guns, smiled, because the arithmetic had just come back around to his favor in front of his own eyes, the way it always did, exactly as he had built his whole life. On it doing, he had forgotten in all his long, careful counting to count the woman, because the woman in that cabin doorway was not the girl who had come up the pass in October with soft hands and a ledger in her heart. The winter had reached into her and taken the loom rooms out of her hands entirely and put something else there in their place, something the mountain had taught her with snares and split pine and a hare's hot blood and a dead man's letter. Mara Quill turned back into the dim cabin and took her father's long rifle down off the 2 wooden pegs over the door, the rifle that Eli had taught her over the snowbound weeks to load and to charge and to hold dead steady against her shoulder, drilling her on it again and again through the dark afternoons, never once telling her why it might matter, maybe never letting himself know why. She charged it the way he had shown her cracked hard fingers moving on their own. She came back and laid the long barrel through the bare inch of the broken shutter, and she sighted down it across the bright snow, and the thing she noticed, in the dead center of all of it, with a strange wide calm, was that her hands were not shaking. That was what she would remember, not the fear, the stillness of her own hands. She did not fire to kill a man from ambush. That was not what the winter had made of her either, and she knew it. She picked her shot the way Eli had taught her to pick it, and she put one round clean through the high crown of Silas Hollister's fine black hat and tore it spinning off his bald head into the snow, close enough that he felt the wind of it part what was left of his hair, and into the great ringing silence that came down. After the shot, she said the only words she would say in the whole of that fight, loud and flat and carrying clear across the snow to every man there. The next one's lower. Asa heard you. Now run. And the thing that Silas Hollister had spent 2 patient years building his entire scheme upon, that a cornered woman folds, that a worthless bench had no defenders worth the name, that the mountain belonged in the end to whichever man could afford to pay for deaths and wait, came apart in the cold, bright air in front of all of them in the space of 10 seconds. The 4 hired men had been paid hard wages to ride up and frighten a homesteader's girl off a dead claim, not to sit their horses in the open and be shot one by one over some old man's testimony. And a coward at the center of a thing makes cowards of the men at its edges, every time. When the deputy's nerve broke first, and it broke first, the Tin Star sawing his horse's head around, The rest went with him like a flock turning. Hollister was the very last to run, and the most undone by it, scrabbling bareheaded and graceless for his stirrup, all the patience and all the contentment gone off his face at last, and the last sight any of them had of the man who had farmed the wolves and called it weather was his fine fur coat going down the muddy thawing trail at a flat dead gallop, with his black hat still lying behind him in the snow where it had spun. Old Asa Pruitt, propped up in the cabin doorway on his mended leg with both root-hard hands folded on the head of a cut pine cane, watched the whole rout of them go down the mountain, and he said, to no one in particular, in the deep and quiet and entirely satisfied voice of a man who has waited 2 long years to be believed, "Well now, he finally counted wrong." Mara did not whoop. She did not laugh or shout after them or say, "I told you so," to the empty, bright snow. She dropped the long rifle in the doorway and she ran, out across the trampled white to the man bleeding into it, and she got her hard new hands into his coat and tore it open, and packed the high shoulder wound with clean fistfuls of snow and wadded wool exactly the way the winter had taught her to pack a thing and stop a bleed, working fast and sure and without one wasted motion. And Eli Vance looked up at her out of a gray face gone slack with shock and pain and said on a thread of breath, "Your hands aren't shaking." And she said, "No, you taught them not to." And he almost smiled then. The man who never did, the corner of his mouth moving before the pain took it back. The roles had reversed completely and all the way, and neither of them would ever once say the word for what had done it. The one who had been carried up out of the dark had become the one who stood in the doorway with the rifle and held the high ground. And the protector lay on his back in the spring snow and let himself, for the first time in 11 burned and frozen years, be kept alive by somebody else's hands, and looked up at her doing it and let her. The end of it is quiet, the way the true ends of true things always are. Word of what had happened up on the pass went down the mountain that spring faster than Hollister's lathered horse could carry him, with Asa Pruitt alive and sitting up and talking to anyone who would climb up to hear it. The brass plate that said "bounties paid" became the very rope that hanged the whole scheme. A territorial man came up from the Capitol in May with a clerk and a satchel, and the bounty fraud, and the salted bait trails and the ordered empty traps and the 2 patient years of it all came out into the daylight one piece at a time. The old man's plain testimony, the spine of all of it. Silas Hollister did not go to a grave, which would have been the clean frontier end of him. He went to a far worse thing for a man built like he was built, which was a courtroom with his own ledgers open on the table in front of him, and every false count and every padded tally read aloud into the record in a clerk's flat voice while the whole district sat and listened. His lease on the entire country around Quill's bench was voided as got by fraud, and the bench itself, the one green shelf of sweet grass that her father had bled 3 summers and a whole life for, came clear and clean and free to the girl who had crossed the pass alive in the snow to hold it. The proving up deadline that she had missed under the snow set, assigned entirely by a territorial judge who said, in open court and on the record, that a claim defended the way that one had been defended was about as thoroughly proved up as any claim in the history of the territory had ever needed to be. Mara Quill stood up that spring to be a woman of property and standing in a country that had priced her the previous October at $40 cash and a laugh in a mercantile. She did not take any of it the way Silas Hollister would have taken it. On the first warm morning that the high meadow showed its first green through the last rotten patches of snow, Eli Vance, mending slow, his bad arm bound up in a sling that Asa had knotted for him, came and put a small heavy poke of his own hard-won gold dust into her hard hand and closed her fingers over it and told her, blunt as he had ever been about anything, that she was free now. Free and landed and clear and owing no living soul one thing. That the lower trail was open all the way down now, and that the road to the home range was dry, and that Oregon was wide and green and waiting, and that she should take the gold and go and live the whole long life that the men down in the flats and the man in the black hat had each in their turn tried to take from her before it started. He gave her the road out, the escape, with both of his hands and pressed it on her. It was the truest and the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, and it cost him everything he had left, and he did it anyway, because giving her the way out was the last logistic, the final act of care disguised as sense, and he could no more not do it than he could stop breathing. She listened to all of it, every word, standing there in the spring sun with the gold heavy in her fist. Then she turned and walked to the green edge of the bench in the morning light, to where the meadow broke off toward the long blue fall of the valley, and she dug a small hole in the soft thawed black ground with the heel of her boot, working it down deep, and she dropped the poke of gold dust into it, the escape money, the road out, the whole of her freedom in a leather sack, and she stamped the wet earth flat down over it with her foot until you could not have found it. And then she reached up and took her mother's thin gold ring off the rawhide string at her throat, the ring worn down nearly to a wire, and she took the carved antler elk down off the cabin window ledge, and she set the two of them together on the flat, broad top stone of the cabin's low front wall. In the full sun, the ring and the clumsy, crooked little elk side by side where the light could find them both at once, and she turned around to a scarred man standing there, not understanding at all what he had just watched her bury, and she told him the truest thing that anybody says in the whole of this story. "I spent my entire life," she said, "keeping a ledger that nobody was holding but me, adding up every kindness, writing down what I owed, bracing every single day for the bill to come due." She looked at the flat place in the ground where the gold was buried, and at the ring and the elk on the sunlit stone, and then at him. "There's no bill. There never was. I finally believe it, all the way down. So I'm done settling, and I'm done running, and I am not staying because I owe you, because I don't, because you made sure I don't." Her hard hands were perfectly steady at her sides. "I'm staying because I choose to, because an elk with one crooked antler turns and hooks and holds the high ground when the big bulls come. And this ground is mine." He didn't give a speech back to her. Men like Eli Vance never do. The words are not in them and never will be. He looked at the thin gold ring and the crooked carved elk sitting together on the sunlit stone for a long, long moment, the spring light full on both of them. And then he reached over with his good hand, and he turned the little elk a half-inch on the stone, the way he had turned it that first gray morning on the window ledge, so that the long, crooked antler caught the light and threw it back. And he said, "All right." Only that. Just the two words. And in the whole language that those two had built between them, all winter long out of split wood and willow bark tea and dry socks given without a word, and bills that never once came due. All right meant every single thing that a wedding could have meant, and a great deal more. Besides, and it asked nothing of her, and it owned no part of her, and there was no white veil in it, and no preacher and no ring put on a finger, and no need in the wide world of any of those things. Only two people who had each been left out in the cold to die alone by everyone they had ever trusted, standing in the bright spring morning, choosing, finally and freely, to stop. The high meadow greened up that summer stronger and richer and deeper than it had ever greened in living memory, as burned over and snowed under and grieved over country always does come back. Because there is some ground that will only ever give you the very best of itself after the worst of the whole year has come all the way down on it and broken it and finally moved on. The 4 head of cattle that scattered into the dark that first night were never all of them found, and in the end it did not matter even a little. Old Asa Pruitt mended slow and stayed on and grumbled at the weather and taught the girl every last secret the high range had ever told him in 30 years of listening to it. And on the low, flat stone of the front wall of a cabin that you could not find in a year of looking for it, a thin gold ring worn down to a wire and a clumsy little elk carved from antler bone, with one antler longer than the other, sat together in the long mountain sun, summer after summer, and the long, crooked antler caught the light and held it. Because here is the thing that the cold teaches you, if it does not kill you first, and you live through enough of it to learn. Love that you keep like a debt is only ever a slower, colder way of being alone, and the single bravest thing that a guarded and frightened heart can ever bring itself to do is to finally let the ledger go unbalanced forever and to call that ruin freedom. So I will leave it with you the same way the mountain left it with her, up there in the snow and the bright spring after. When the storm closes the only trail you have left, and every last person you respect has told you to your face to turn back and go down, do you run down the mountain with all the others and stay safe, and stay warm, and stay alone? Or do you climb up alone into the white after the one single soul that nobody else will go back for? Sit with that one a while tonight. The wind-up here never stops asking it, and it doesn't ask you any questions you can answer with a word.